It was supposed to be an end to the Danish Civil War and a celebration of peace. But by the third day of revelries, one of the three men who were fighting for the throne was dead, another wounded, and the third was being blamed. So what really happened in the Danish capital city of Roskilde on August 9th, 1157? Was it an acceptable preventative strike or just good old premeditated murder? Let's travel back in time now to the middle of the 12th century in Scandinavia and find out about Danish political affairs, family feuds, and treachery. In today's video, we're talking about all things backstabbing, brutality, and blood feasts. The medieval period was full of that sort of stuff, and we normally think that we've moved on from that as a society, although often that's not exactly the case. Our sponsor today, Magellan TV, has an amazing selection of documentaries about all sorts of topics, but the one that I really enjoyed recently was called Promises and Betrayal. It's a no-holds-barred look at British double-dealing during the First World War, which led to conflict in the Middle East. The documentary takes an unflinching approach to the ensuing legacy of bloodshed in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Jews, telling the story of rival empires and badly thought-out strategies. Sometimes it's reassuring to look at the past and think we've moved on from that period. Other times, we need to realise that we've not progressed as much as we might have thought. Promises and Betrayal combines never-before-seen footage and Foreign Office communications to see how meddling with the wrong things leads to dangerous consequences. Just like Knut, Valdemar, and Svein. We've partnered with Magellan TV to give you a totally free 1-month trial so you can watch Promises and Betrayal for yourself and let me know what you think. Magellan is completely ad-free and has a massive collection of 4K content that they add to every week. I'm always finding new things to watch to fuel my brain. And now for today's video. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Happy families. All of the people who were involved in the bloody banquets were related, so strap in tight because this might get a little complicated. We will begin with King Svein II of Estriden, who founded his own dynasty. Married 3 times, he fathered at least 20 children, 16 of them male with different mothers, 5 of whom later became kings themselves. Knut the Saint, Harald Hen, Olaf Hunger, Niels and Eric Evergood. Svein II was the grandson of Svein I Forkbeard, his mother Estrid being Forkbeard's daughter and sister to the kings Knut the Great and Harald II. Because royal families shared so many names, it was easier to know which one was which by attaching nicknames to them. Svein II was born in England and grew up to be a military leader and pillaged the area of northern Germany in 1040. His cousin Knut III, who was son of Knut the Great, made him a Jarl, and Svein headed a campaign against Magnus I to capture the country of Norway, but was defeated. In 1042, Knut III died and Magnus claimed the Danish throne, making Svein the Jarl of Jutland in the continental area of Denmark. In 1043, the men battled at Lyskov Heath near the border with Germany. Svein won and was crowned king by Danish nobles. But later Magnus defeated him several times and Svein had to flee to Sweden. On his return, he was able to gain control of Scania, the southernmost area of Sweden, which at the time was part of Denmark. It wasn't until 1045 that the war between Svein and Magnus ended because Harald Hardrada returned from exile in Norway and joined forces with Svein. Magnus gave in to his uncle and agreed to co-rule the throne of Norway with him. This pact ended pretty quickly as Magnus died a year later in 1047 and Harald became sole ruler. Magnus made Svein king of Denmark on his deathbed, with Svein declaring, quote, "Now so help me God, I shall never yield Denmark." Boys, boys, boys. Now we can return to Svein's sons. Svein died in 1076 and by a process of election, which was how monarchs were chosen in Denmark, his illegitimate son Harald III Hen became king. He was known as quite a weak and ineffectual leader, which explains the nickname of Harald Hen. Hen comes from the Danish word for whetstone, meaning that he was really known as Harald the Soft. After just 4 years, Harald died and Knut IV the Holy began his reign as Danish king in 1080. He was another of Svein's sons from an unknown mistress. Knut the Holy had ambitions to rule England like his great-uncle Knut the Great, but it wasn't meant to be. He died during a peasants' revolt after a short reign of just 6 years. His loyalty to the Catholic Church meant that he was later canonized. Next came his brother Olaf I, known as Olaf Hunger. His reign was overshadowed by several years of failed crops, hence the nickname. He was able to stay on the throne for 9 years until he died in mysterious circumstances, and was followed by his brother Eric I, known as the Good. Now, 4 kings in 24 years was not a good look, especially when the kingdom in question was already unstable. But this next king, Eric the Good, was able to quell the civil unrest. But then he also died in less than a decade, leaving his 7-year-old son Canute Lavard behind. This meant that Eric's brother Niels now ascended to the throne. He was able to manage a reign of 30 years, 26 of them in relative prosperity and peace before his death. King Niels also provided his nephew Canute Lavard with great titles and opportunities, which he took advantage of when defeating the West Slavic tribe of Oberites. However, there was trouble when Niels' son Magnus the Strong invited the popular and charismatic Canute to his estate on Zealand to celebrate Christmas with his family. On the 7th of January 1131, Magnus lured Canute Lavard into Haraldstead Forest, where he was set upon and murdered. Civil war broke out almost immediately when Canute's brother Erik Eriksson was determined to take revenge. The feud of 1131 to 1134 ended when Magnus the Strong was killed at the Battle of Fodevig, and his father King Niels, who was 70 years old at this point, was attacked and murdered as he fled south. Eric now became known as Eric II the Memorable. His reign lasted just 3 years before, being ever so popular, King Eric was killed by a nobleman. His nephew Erik Hakonson was declared the next king of Denmark and was nicknamed the Lamb because of his piety. After a 9-year reign, and for some unknown reason, Eric the Lamb was the first Danish king in history to abdicate the throne. He retired to St. Canute's Abbey, where still in his mid-20s, he died only 2 years later. It is this abdication that led to the next round of royal Danish infighting between his son Svein and the other 2 great-grandsons of King Svein II, Canute V and Valdemar I. The plot seemed complicated, but put simply, this was essentially a family feud. The 3 men involved were cousins, each ruling their own little part of Denmark, with one of them wanting to rule it all. The 12th century author and historian Svein Egerson described what happened next in his history of Denmark. Quote, "And when he was dead, Knut the son of Magnus was made the king at Viborg Assembly, and Sven was put on the throne by the Scanians. And while they were engaged in numerous battles, Valdemar, the scion of holy blood, gained possession of his father's fief and gave assistance to both in turn, as if he stood between them. However, after a long time, a council was held in Lolland, and the rulers decided to divide the kingdom into equal thirds and to conform the treaty by an oath. But the treaty did not remain firm for long, as the outcome of the arrangements showed. For after the council had been held, the 3 we have mentioned came together that autumn in the city of Roskilde for a feast, and they dined first with King Svein. The peace and trust between them had been broken, and he had prepared a trap. He planned to kill Canute and Valdemar that evening after Vespers by means of commissioners previously instructed. When the lights had been snuffed, they slew Canute and crowned him with martyrdom. But whilst they were trying to run Valdemar through with a naked sword, he was seriously wounded in the thigh. But God's grace preserved him and he escaped. However, as soon as he had recovered somewhat from the pain of his wound, he set out for Jutland and gathered together an army. Sven, who was the king of Scania, hastened after Valdemar, king of Jutland, and they joined battle at Grata. Nor was the victory long in doubt, for Sven was beaten and killed by the hand of a peasant, and so the glorious victor King Valdemar gained possession of the kingdom. And so we have 3 men all vying for the throne of Denmark, each one being declared king by their own followers. Valdemar, who was only 15 at the time of Eric III's abdication, took a step back in the early part of the Civil War and supported either Svein or Canute depending on who he felt was winning. However, he was swayed over to Canute's side by the time of the Blood Feast with an alliance of marriage, although Valdemar remained quite friendly with Svein. After the abdication of Eric III, Svein III was elected king of Zealand and Canute V was elected king in Scania. Svein then defeated Canute 3 times with the help of his cousin Valdemar, and by 1153 Svein had control over most of Denmark. Then Valdemar switched allegiance, and after becoming co-regent with Canute by 1155, they had expelled Svein from the land. By 1156, Svein returned with German assistance and peace negotiations began. The agreement was that Denmark was divided up into 3 kingdoms. Svein was given Zealand and Scania with its Swedish provinces, Canute was to have the island of Funen, and Valdemar was given central Jutland. In celebration of this peace deal, Svein hosted a feast at Roskilde. Although Canute clearly distrusted Svein, Valdemar was able to convince him to attend both the peace accords at Lolland and the Roskilde feast. In the run-up to the treaty at Lolland, Svein tried to ally himself with Valdemar again, but was told that, quote, he was wasting his time if he was going to go on trying to shatter the sympathy between Canute and himself. Svein said he had no such intention. Having naively convinced both men to trust one another, the feast went ahead. We are told by Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish historian, that it was all a dastardly plot made up by Svein well in advance to put Canute at his ease and then have one of his soldiers, who was named Deadly, kill him. On the third day of the feast, Svein retired from the hall, leaving Canute alone with Valdemar. As the attack began, Valdemar leapt out of his chair. He defended himself by wrapping a cloak around his hand and fending off Deadly's blows. He was wounded on the leg, but managed to escape through the door. Canute was not so fortunate, and Deadly stabbed him in the head. Canute died in the arms of a man named Absalon, who would later become the Archbishop of Lund. 2 more men named Dobik and Constantine tried to help Absalon leave the hall, but they were both killed. Absalom was able to get past the guards, but he was stopped by another group of men as he tried to seek sanctuary in the Cathedral of the Trinity before finally being rescued. So the future King of Denmark and Archbishop of Lund had narrowly escaped death. Within just a couple of months, by the 23rd of October, Valdemar and Svein were to meet one last time for a final battle at Grada Heath and end the civil wars once and for all. There, Svein was defeated as he fled the battlefield. Some peasants caught him when his horse became sucked down into a bog and murdered him. Finally, Valdemar was able to unite the country with the loyal Archbishop and chief advisor Absalon at his side. He made sure that he was seen as an innocent bystander during the murderous blood feast, saying, quote, "I wish it to be known to everyone, present and future, that certain traitors who were enjoying a pleasant meal with me and were engaging me in friendly conversation, without warning sought to run me through with naked blades, unarmed as I was and not fearing any such thing. But God's mercy was without end, without help from anyone it protected me, and with great power pulled me out from the mists of armored men." Of course, it was Svein and his men who murdered King Canute V, but Valdemar had been playing his 2 cousins off against one another for quite a while. Perhaps Svein had actually ended up being a pawn of the man who had reigned for 28 years and become one of Denmark's most successful rulers, earning himself the nickname Valdemar the Great. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers!